Thank you so much, Anka. Thank you, IACCP, and thank you everyone who organized. Some of you are very friendly faces. I've been seeing you work throughout the year. And I think this was the only year when Anka wrote so many emails saying that, oh, I need this, I'm doing this. And I was like, okay, there's just too much work happening, so we should just give her some space in Global Minds. So for me personally, Global Minds is one of the programs I closely feel with. And I think it goes without saying that it's really our child. And there are many mothers of that child in this program. Melanie and Anka, of course, taking the lead. We are just at the back seat. So today I will be talking about narratives of vulnerable and marginalized communities from the Global South. I would prefer if the discussion can be at the end. And if you have more questions, we can also follow up on the very famous app, which is very productive, actually. So before I start, with what I'm going to present, I think it's really crucial and important to talk about my own positionality, who I am, and why the kind of work I do is very applied and it's important for me and also for the communities that I represent and I work with. So I come from Islamabad, which is relatively very different terrain than the communities I've been working in the last 10 years at least. But I really want to acknowledge that I have worked not only as an immigrant on the foreign lands, but also within my own country. It's a huge country from north to south, so your own positionality, your religion, your culture, and the ethnicity you come from, all of that determines how you look at research, your participants. But one thing that I've always kept in mind, I think primarily being an immigrant in other countries, it makes you more sensitive when you go back and you have to work in the same field. So in that sense, I think it has always been working with the community rather than working on communities, and that changes your perspective quite a bit. But why not use the mainstream perspective that's available? There are amazing, fabulous researchers in psychology who have produced tremendous amount of knowledge. I personally think, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, at Global Minds, we are always open for new perspectives and challenges. But I genuinely think that there are many things that are overly stated when it comes to physical aspects, when it comes to sustainability and climate change. There is a very strong aspect of climate coloniality. It continues to persist, and we see it not only in the way how knowledge on climate change and sustainability is developing, but also in our own psychological knowledge. And then I think, as you all know, there is most of research that's been focusing or primarily looking at weird cultures and then pitching many of us from the Global South in those parameters and look at it okay, so here are these indicators, and then compared to that, this is how Global South falls. But I think essentially we miss this crucial point that yes, we are different in many ways, but there are many commonalities. But when it comes to climate change, you can't use a linear perspective. It's just very difficult to use. Why? First of all, I think coloniality and climate change discourse, it needs to be changed. And of course, it's not just creating new knowledge and just saying it in the passing that yes, there are ways, we need to change it, but then also showing through the research that we do how we can actually execute that. So in that sense, I think you all know what coloniality is, and it's not that colonial times are over. In our knowledge making, in our knowledge production, in co-production of knowledge that contemporary science is doing, it continues to persist in many ways. Particularly it's in the sense of climate change, of course, the debate and the narrative, it's very it's magnifying on its scale, but when it comes to representation, who are the voices who actually get to talk about these phenomena, these processes? So I think in that sense, it's really crucial to not only think about what's happening now, but also look at the historical marginalization of communities that come from the Global South. And also, I'm not by any way saying that within the Global North, there is a lot of equality. There is immense inequality. And me coming from Canada, having Canadian citizenship, I also come with many burdens that I see over there. So by no means I am intending to say that there is just inequality in the Global North and Global South dynamics. It's persistent, it's everywhere, but who gets to represent them and who gets to participate in these discourses, I think that's important to discuss. And I think that brings me nicely to the next point. Of course, there is a big Global North and South divide, and we can see it how when we are sitting in discussions in the global north, we can easily talk about mitigation, climate mitigation, sustainability, and also climate adaptation. But who has resources? Where did these resources come from? Who are the people who are actually carrying all the burden of the climate change, of the sustainability not happening, and why it's not happening? So I think in that sense, it's important to see for many people who work as researchers or who work with communities in the global north, there are choices that they can make. Many times in the global south, you don't have those privileges, those choices that can be made. So I think it's important to look at scholars who have worked from the global south perspective, but also many crucial scholars, some of you among in this audience, but it's really crucial to decolonize the perspective and the knowledge that we have been creating in psychology. One major and I think quite prevalent notion that we see in the physical aspect of sustainability, it's about when countries have funding, they will throw in that funding in the global south, but not from the perspective that lives will be improved. It's also for serving certain class system. So being aware of where our funding goes and how we implement those funds, it's also important. Particularly when it comes to how the global south looks like, we want to romanticize it, but we again go back to those colonial roots. And what was preferred by our colonial legacies at that given time. And sometimes I think it creates more disruptions rather than providing more solutions for sustainability. So keeping all of these things in mind, I thought it would be important to look at some of the vulnerabilities that are unequal, but also how do they impact people who are at the really lowest ring of the ladder when it comes to global south. I'm going to blur some of the images because they can be disturbing some of the people. But generally to say, this is, these are two pictures from last heat wave. When many people who were not able to sit inside their houses, they had to go to open spaces, but there were no open shelters. And this is a picture from Karachi in Pakistan. And then many of them, they are also sitting outside this morgue where people are trying to collect the bodies of their relatives, of their loved ones, because they died on the street when they were walking around for work. Most of the time, these are laborers, daily wage workers. So there are many inequalities within the global south, within the cities that we see as very global, very equal, or very privileged in some sense, but that equality doesn't exist. And again, I don't want to just talk about one system of knowledge, but just to co-produce, it's also important to know what else is happening in the larger global southern region. So from Southeast Africa to Bangladesh, India, Pakistan, heat waves, floods, deforestation in East Asia. When it comes to deltas are very important physical systems. And local knowledge is very important for understanding, and not only the psychological or physical understanding, but also for contributing to sustainable development goals, as we call them. So also, when we are not able to know the systems of knowledge, we are not able to protect the livelihoods of people, nor we can protect the food securities and all the other elements. So it's important to know that there are multiple intersectionalities. First, where you are based in Global South, you might have your own vulnerabilities, but then also your identities, your social norms, how you have been placed, culturally speaking, what kind of historical colonial narratives you carry, all of that also has an impact. So before, for example, Britishers went to India, I think it's an important example to quote. It was rather egalitarian society where multiple religions had been living for thousands of years, quite peacefully. But then, you have these colonial incidents that happen, and these are relatively long incidents. Sometimes it's 150 years, that's in case of Pakistan, but then in India and Pakistan, subcontinent, Bangladesh. But there are also other places where it has been even for the longer time. So these histories are really important because they determine how we develop our knowledge, how we execute our research, and how we make our collaborations. So for us, it was kind of important to root somewhere in the knowledge that we had, but also to continue in a way that we integrate some of the local knowledge in the traditions that are available, but also challenge some of those traditions because they don't always fit in the terrain when we are working in other areas. And particularly for us, it was important to look at how climate change can exacerbate colonial histories, traumas. And it's particularly because many times in colonial times, people were displaced forcefully, but also when there were famines and they were not provided with food. So food insecurity, displacement, and all of these other elements that are embedded in sustainability, they have huge impact on these populations. So as a project that has kind of looked at some of these elements, but also tried to decolonize knowledge that comes from different places in the world, particularly in the Global South, I would present you a little bit of glimpse of what we have been doing for a while. And this project is it's based on multiple projects. But it's important to know that most of the work that was done in field, it was done with local communities, community leaders, and people who have been local and indigenous to the lands where we were working. And of course, we were leading the project, but communities were leading themselves. We were not the ones who were intervening in a way that would create more trauma or any difficulties for the local populations. And here, my colleague, Arabella Fraser, who is based out of Open University in the UK, Dr. Nausheen Anwar, who is at the Institute of Development Studies in the UK, and Karachi Urban Lab, which is at the Business Administration Institute, which is in Pakistan, and Courtney Design Institution. It was really important for us to work across disciplines. So some of them, they are urban geographers, some of them, they are climate scientists, some of them, they are from different fields. But I, as psychologist, of course, I had my own knowledge of the field, but I was also surprisingly open to so many other things that I didn't know before working with all these people cross-disciplinary. So probably one of the takeaways could be that if we work cross fields, I think we learn much more than we are usually afraid of. In the background work, we had a lot of work going on, and it's very interesting that now when I look back at some of the work that we have produced, I look at it in a way that, well, you know what, my own way of thinking was very much influenced by the institution where I was trained, be it institutions in the US or in Canada or in Germany. I think amazing institutions, but the way knowledge works, it's for the local audience, of course for international audience too, but we always have to adapt these tools, the mechanisms, the methods we develop. So how did we dismantle our own work? So we looked back at the work that we were doing. We developed a network which is now called Climate Change and Urban Violence Network. At the moment, we are working with almost 23 countries from the Global South, and we are trying to bring everyone together with their own methods and technologies, whatever local knowledge they have, and how we can help them in developing and adapting to their own local goals. So instead of looking at a very linear picture, okay, these are physical effects, these are psychological, we started to dismantle all of this, and we started to work with very intersectional approaches that we were not that aware of, let's say before, at least I wasn't. So in this project, what we started with, it was very kind of simple, but as we grew with different projects onwards, it changed over time. And I think that's also kind of what Anka was saying. You move forward, you learn, and then you also look at your own projects and say, hey, I could have done this differently, and then you actually go ahead and do it. So basically, we were focused at exploration of climate-related direct impacts and relevance with local cultural practices so that we could offer people more locally based adaptations for their sustainability issues and problems. And more stressful factors and hazards and vulnerabilities, because our framework was very much influenced by people from different fields, so we accommodated everyone's needs. But again, all those ideas went into field, but they were only executed when they were vetted by the communities where we were working. This project particularly, it went on to work in Karachi, Colombo, and Canberra. Karachi, as you know, it's based in Pakistan. Colombo, it's in Sri Lanka and Kibera is one of the largest urban slums in Kenya. And here we had fantastic local teams we were collaborating with. And also now I think you understand why this project was really close to our heart, because we were working south to south collaborations. There were relatively less inequalities in deliberation, in the execution of the project, and in the learnings that we were doing. So innovation and the participatory methods, they were really at the heart of all of this. What we did in the first project, we started with observations. So really we went in the field, every site, be it Kibera, be it Karachi, be it anywhere in Colombo, we were spending literally months there. And this was happening during COVID, before COVID. So all of this had really important implications for us as researchers as well, a lot of learning as well. And in each city, we also went ahead and we looked for 2 sites which were actually more vulnerable than rest of the city. So it was not that we were going linearly and finding the best sites where we could just distribute surveys, get them back, and just continue with our work. We actually looked for people who were at the forefront of hazards that were impacting these communities. And then in the phase 2, not only looking at what was happening there, we went ahead with everything that we had developed in the field, and we tried to map different hazards that were happening in these places. And temporality was a really important factor, because it's not you have perfect day and perfect night in these places, especially when you work with vulnerable and marginalized populations. Days can be very stressful and evenings can be even more stressful. So temporality was a really important element for us. Then another aspect was that we really wanted to go for how to look at the social and infrastructural vulnerabilities, where we were executing workshops where all the experts from the field, they were brought together and they were developing adaptation plan with these communities. And then we saw how it impacted them in general. So depending upon where we were working, we also worked separately with men and women, and sometimes where cultural systems and norms they allowed us, we also worked with them together. And then the second big project that we worked on, it really delved deeper into the qualitative narratives to build the stories from the local perspective, not we bringing our own voice as researchers forward, but actually using their voices so that they could represent themselves. And lastly, in the third project, we actually tried to go all out on technology using GIS and all the heat sensors and everything. And this project is still happening. And at the moment, we have almost 13,000 surveys where we are going from local city perspectives now to the national level. So what we did in the observation, it was basically to determine what are actual hazards, what do people report, what are their narratives, so that we could build our project based on that. Just to give you a bit of perspective, Karachi is a city which is highly, highly unequal. We have 25 million people, according to some estimates. 62% of the residents live in informal settlements, which really means that these are borderline situations where you have water and you don't have water. You have access to sanitation, you don't have access to sanitation. But more importantly, it was crucial for us to work in such a center because it's a hotspot for heat waves, for floods. So every year when there is monsoon season, you will have floods, and also you will have heat waves. So over time, to work in these temporalities, I think it was a good selection. And of course, some of us being local from that place, it helped us. Some of the things that we observed during even the first year, it was really striking to us to see that there is just so much inequality depending upon on which side of the river you live, like in many countries and many spaces. You have almost no or a lot of access to adaptability or climate adaptation. So for example, here you see that a daily wage worker who would usually spend a lot of time working in the sun during heat waves, they would go and they would sleep in places like mosques. But women, on the other hand, because they have to stay at home, and for them it's not in many places possible to go out and get a fresh air or something. For them, the core temperatures go way high. Many of them faint and then they are brought to the hospitals. So in that sense, I think it's really difficult to use one approach in one place and kind of like, continue throughout. So that's why we had to kind of like, develop different perspectives, different local knowledge strategies to work across the cities. Another big issue with Karachi was that people who live next to waterfronts, whenever there is flooding, they are almost like, always blamed for that, instead of the city governments and others adapting or cleaning those water channels. So there is a huge issue of also displacement. So when there are floods, poor people are like, at the forefront of risking their homes because they will be the next one to be displaced. The second site that we selected, it was in Colombo in Sri Lanka, and I think that was also important, not only like, for the economic kind of like, similar reasons that we were experiencing in both countries at that time, but also we had fantastic team who had already worked on migration, climate-based migration, and floods-related migration that could provide us with a good baseline to work with. And here we also worked with communities that were really like, next to waterfront and some of the most marginalized communities within the country. These are some of the pictures from right, like, at the beginning of our observations. And the third project site in this one was Kibera, where this was in Kenya, where this is one of the largest urban slum in the global south, and here the inequality is like, totally at another level, but the local team that we were working with, they are design institution, which means that they had a lot of urban infrastructural support that they could provide us, and the GIS system where they could provide like, early heat warning system, early weather warning system, it was much applicable here. So we had a lot to learn from this place. And here, again, as you can see, it's really like, next to Nairobi, which is the capital, and like you have a lot of resources and abundance, but then right next to that, you have one of the biggest urban slums. So it creates certain type of inequality within the global south, how the rich and the poor in the same country can live a very different life. And here we worked in two neighborhoods again. It was Sokomoko and Ndolo. And it was really important for us to have two neighborhoods in each of these sites, because then you could actually like, create some local comparison and provide best practices that comes out of the field. And that was the end goal of the project anyways. So across the field, when we were going from Kibera to Colombo to Karachi, everywhere, these were the stressors that emerged. So like, any household we went to, and these are not observations where we are just going and talking to people randomly. We are actually going from household to household, and we are talking to people to figure out what are their exact problems, and then we had like, a tentative list that we made based on our own best expertise, and that was totally thrown out of the window. And then people told us, okay, these are the things that are actually more important for us. Of course, like psychological violence and psychological well-being emerged, and I was very happy as a psychologist in the project. Hey, look, I was all along talking about this. Then what we did, we took the same survey and all of those elements, we put them on like, our own psychological measurement scales, and we went into one by one all of these sites where we had been working. We started off with Kausar colony, which is in Karachi. And here it was really interesting also to come across other dynamics. So religious diversity within communities that used to be very helpful for adaptation strategies, but in the times of climate shocks and climate conflicts, that exacerbates all the existing vulnerabilities. Similarly, the other one was Ilyas Court, which was even more vulnerable because they didn't have any infrastructure to begin with. So they were more prone to fire. When there were heat waves, they did not have any place for shade. So it was even more difficult for these communities. So again, even within the inequalities that exist, there is another intersection of what is your socioeconomic status, on which side of the river you live in these communities. And here it was mostly Hindus and Muslims. And again, most of the time they live quite peacefully. But as soon as a climate shock would hit, you would see a lot of violence happening or unfolding in these communities. I would just quickly give you an understanding of the socioeconomic status here. As you can see, almost 91% of the people in these communities, they work in informal settlement, which means that their livelihoods are already pretty insecure. The moment a climate shock would hit, for example, a heat wave or floods, it all boils down to people not having security related to food or their livelihoods. And through, we saw that 100% of people, they were reporting that they have been hit, like just the given year, they were hit by either a heat wave or with the floods, or at least one of them, and sometimes even with multiple hazards. So for example, in some communities, we also saw that there were fires during the summer heat. So using just a very basic framework just to execute or show what we did. So all of these hazards were mapped. So for example, in Gulnaz colony, we saw that during the floods, we had a lot of coverage. So for example, all of these hazards, they would pop out. But even after the floods, they had more hazards, which means that they become more vulnerable to state violence and many other forms of violence or vulnerabilities after the floods. So it's not that it's just the incident itself, it also persists on temporality levels. Similarly, when we go to the other neighborhood, which was Ilyascote, here also we see that on all elements, it's even greater than the hazards in the Gulnaz colony, but they also kind of exacerbate after the climate incident or shock has happened. So in that sense, it was really a good learning point for us. So where is it where we need to invest our energies? Is it before the incidents, during the incident, or after the incident? So according to that, similarly, we developed strategies for Colombo or for Nairobi. So the second phase of the project was actually to look into these temporalities and work with how these communities can be supported on those climate adaptation efforts. So what we started doing, we started to gather on average 40, 50 women and then 40, 50 men. We would spend a day or two with them initially to work out what are the key stressors during and after, try to filter out some of the things. And in that way, we were able to assess that some of these things that were more crucial for these people than others. So we, in the first wave, we decided that we will go right after the flood so that we can have some parameter of that's the time when they need more support, because we had some funding and then you can support the communities in several ways. And then this was really interesting. So before the workshop, if you look at the stress levels, and I'm not saying that it worked in every community, but at least in 2 communities in the beginning, we saw that actually sometimes it can provide some help in places like Gulnaz colony, because they are relatively better to do, not well to do, but relatively better to do, because if you have some existing infrastructure, if you have some stability, it can still help you. But if you go to places like Ilyascote, I mean, no matter how many workshops you have done, it might not help. So then we had to come back, all of us together, and try to strategize, okay, how do we go back to field? How do we intervene? Because it's really stressful, not only for us, but also to take up the time of all these people who have very insecure livelihoods. So how do you battle with those norms of ethics and everything else that goes into the project? So I think in that sense, it was really crucial learning point that at least in some of the things we were able to help them, but also coming to peace and coming to terms with the fact that not every time all the adaptation strategies that we take as experts, they might not work in the field. Another thing that was really important and really good for us to see overall in these communities was before we conducted the workshop, we saw that people did not get much support, as you can see in this graph, but after that they were actually reaching out more within the community, and this we learned later on why this was happening. So I'll talk about it later when I come to the qualitative part of the project, but just keep this figure in mind. So basically, for example, initially they were hesitant to reach out to their community because they felt ashamed, they felt they were being dishonored by the state, why should they reach out to other people for support? But after the workshop, when 50 people were sitting and everyone was talking about the same narratives, it kind of made them open up to reach out to others for seeking some support. The project too was really kind of crucial for answering many of the questions that we had. So for example, in the first one, we were really curious that, okay, so what are the baselines? What are the projects or the dimensions we should work with when it comes to vulnerabilities? But here we actually we try to understand their own narratives, their own voices, and what is it that resolves issues, or what is it that presses them the most. So before we went into field in all three cities, we made sure that all of us, we sit together, and we had these really days-long workshops for ourselves to come to terms with that we don't have to use singular methodologies. So depending upon where we were working, we had to develop more specific ways of working with people, also being more open to, for example, one of these things were happening during the pandemic. So depending upon how violent the state was towards poor, we also had to strategize so that we don't put them into any kind of trouble. So we developed, hopefully we think so, culturally sensitive strategies. We started with our own focus groups, but then we developed this framework where we could actually work across the board, but adapt locally, because all the things were happening in their own local languages, their own local people were doing it, while we were there, not intervening when the fieldwork was happening, but every day at the end of the day, we were going through every transcript and figuring out what's going on here. One of the basic framework that we started with in the beginning, and that helped us quite a bit, and it also kind of nicely projected everything else that came from the field. It was about the identities people hold. So depending upon the ethnicity, the religion, and how much people want to get support from their communities, how okay it is for them to reach out to others, it really helped people. And also it was very helpful for us as a basic framework. So we saw that three dimensions that emerged across the board, no matter if we were in Colombo or in Canberra or in Karachi. It was always there. So community articulation, so the social support, the needs for social support, they might be different, but they were always there. These were really important elements for people. Then, what were the alternate ways to get help or to seek help? So these were things that we understood only when we went in the field, because people were also comfortable in working with certain organizations, but there were also some organizations that were like, okay, they have been very much on the front of promoting their own agendas, be they religious or others. So people were very sensitive to those kinds of notions. And then also, I think it was really important for us to look at the gender lens, because many things that emerged in our surveys, we were not able to understand them. But then in the qualitative research, we were able to delve deeper that why those kinds of gender differences were coming in. So just to give you few examples, these are of course not representative, but it's important to state in their own words so that their voice also gets representation. So for example, here a male who is 67 years old, he's saying that we feel ashamed and dishonored when we have to ask our relatives for support, food and shelter. And we are hardworking people and don't want to sound like beggars. Only our local community workers come here with food packages when the floods have passed. We have gone through floods so many times that now we are used to getting our homes devastated and our respect lost. Rich people don't care because their homes don't drown. We care because our spirit is broken yearly and too often. So this is a narrative that's coming from a man in Canberra who is relatively old. And I mean, it reflects, it's not only people's identities, their communities, it's also within the community. Sometimes if they have reached out to people for too many times for help, it can become really harder for them to seek help. Similarly, there's a lot of mistrust in the government. So if people do not trust the government, where they will go? So that's why I think it's really important to work on community articulation in these communities. Here, for example, no, wait, this can't be right. Wait, sorry. Okay, so I wanted to show the other narrative, but I think it's, okay, yeah. So let's work, sorry, it's not just going forward. So social norms and disproportional stressors, it's also kind of really important that we understand social norms through these deeper conversations and narratives that come from people, rather than we being someone who will come with prompts and try to understand their stories. So, for example, here, a 47-year-old female is saying that due to our traditions and values, women stay at home. We are most affected since it's hot and humid during and after floods. There is unbearable suffocation inside the house. We are often stuck at home while men can roam around and even take public showers. It is not easy for men too. Many of our men have died in heat waves due to heat stroke because they work in the scorching sun as laborers, right? So there are inequalities, right? Someone is suffering at home, but there are also other levels of inequalities. And what these women wanted to say, it's really that they can go out if there is a freshwater pipe which is burst, or it's consciously burst by someone, just to take some respite from the heat. But it's not as pleasant as it might sound. And we have been to some of these places for observations, and it's really not the most glorious thing. So one of the other things that we saw was that because most men, they work as labor across the board in Colombo, in Kibera, and also in Karachi, women face multiple vulnerabilities, especially if their home is half damaged during the flood. Because then they don't have enough security, and at night, if they have to take care of their belongings or their children, they stay awake. So these kinds of vulnerabilities you can only understand when you spend a lot of time in developing these narratives and working with the communities. So what are the learnings? So what are the key takeaways that I think that come out of these projects that I've presented? First, we need to recognize multiple ways of knowing, using our own very typical standardized surveys. It might not help, especially if we are going to new communities, if we are going to assess, and if we have to make adaptation plans for certain communities, we might have to think differently and more openly. Then equitable research, partnership, and co-production of knowledge. Everything that we have done, all the policy papers, all the policy briefs, all the research reports, everything that's coming, we are engaging with everyone who has worked with us in the field. So the author list gets a bit longer, but I think it's also important to give voice and representation to all those people who work with us from the Global South. Because I mean, once you cross the border, you also have to remember, you were on the other side once, at least. I mean, that's how I feel. Then community consent and benefit. Throughout these projects, every time we had IDRC funding, we had British Academy funding, we had UCRI funding. Now we are applying for this NFRF because our project was listed in COP27, and we are going to COP28 for some adaptation strategies that came out of the field. But it was really important for us to develop this consent before we actually got the money. So it was really kind of covering our bases first, making our connections with the communities. No matter if we would get money or not, we would actually work with you for a couple of years. So this project has been happening now for 4 years almost. And we are going to the 5th year because we just got a really generous funding. So it's really important to not start something and then run away, because these communities, they also kind of they develop that relationality of trust. It's important for them to know that these people are going to be here if something goes wrong. And in fact, in one of the places when we were working, 2 of our research assistants, they were picked by someone, and then we had to kind of get them back. So these are also state violence strategies that are there in the field. So we also have to account for those kinds of incidents. Then contextualization of narratives, but making sure that they are coming from the local perspective. I mean, we being researchers, just because we are the ones who are getting the grants or getting the funding, we should not be the ones to take a lead on even knowledge production. It should really come from the field. And then engaging with intersectional and decolonial pedagogies. And I think the most beautiful thing that I find about our Global Minds program is that we really decolonize everything that we bring to our classroom. At least, I mean, every time I have been in the summer schools or working with colleagues, trying to understand how they're teaching, this is one of the very dominant narratives. So I'm very privileged to be in that position that we can work all of that. And then potential for more equitable, culturally appropriate interventions, not just like, taking interventions from one place and implementing it in wherever we are going. The third project, I'm not going to discuss this one at the moment because there is just so much in that project, and I am out of time. Perfect. So our ongoing project is actually measuring with heat sensor how we can measure core temperatures of people and what are the times when we can actually intervene to save their lives. So this is kind of like, quite hardcore, interesting intervention, but also kind of like, we have to go through a lot of pain to get all these sensors and everything working. So there is a lot more of collaboration and all the other work and many more beautiful people who have been working with us in the field and outside. So yeah, we will have a discussion time now, but if you have any other comments afterwards, please feel free to reach me. And of course, it takes a village to do all these kinds of things, and I'm very grateful to this platform for getting the opportunity to discuss this. Yeah, thank you.